Mr. Ash, welcome to the program. So there are a lot of questions and speculations regarding whether a long-term settlement can actually be reached in the Middle East. Even if a peace deal is reached, do you think that a return to normal for energy prices, especially oil, will come immediately, or do you think it will take time?
Well, I mean, there's short, medium and long, right? I mean, I guess in the short term, as we've seen in the last couple of days, right? I mean, any possibility of a peace will probably drop oil a little bit, somewhat. Maybe then what the Strait, the reality will be that the Straits probably will relatively slow to open up. Maybe Iran will string negotiations out. Iran feels like it's in a position of strength. Mm-hmm. We know what Iran wants. I mean, they want sanctions moderation, economic assistance. They want some kind of assurity that Israel and the US won't attack again. And they're good negotiators, right? I mean, they tend to negotiate pretty hardcore. So maybe there's a bit of disappointment, and then maybe, oil and commodity prices generally stay higher. And we will see lots of supply chain disruptions, right? But then the interesting thing is further out, maybe slightly longer term. And I guess the risk, if you're an oil producer, I mean, a couple of really interesting things have happened, right? I mean, one is the UAE leaving OPEC, right? Big deal, big move. Clearly, UAE is going to pump oil significantly, right? And so longer term, that should push oil prices lower. And I'd also argue that this period of higher oil prices that we've had for a couple of months on the Iran thing, maybe lasting a bit longer, probably see demand destruction. So, we might have a scenario where, 6 months out, a year out, oil prices possibly could be significantly lower than they were at the start of the war, right? So it's a bit complicated. Oil prices are always very difficult to forecast, but probably, near term a little bit lower, then push up a bit, and then ultimately maybe lower. But a lot depends on, the impact on global growth from all this disruption, and whether the crisis in the Gulf stops soon, right? I mean, that's the question mark.
Very different scenarios that's on the page right now, so it's very hard to predict, I assume.
Yeah, sure.
Well, energy prices remain a major inflation risk, and Turkey is definitely feeling that heat. Markets have started to revise year-end inflation expectations toward the 30% range. Given the current macro environment, what is your baseline inflation scenario for the remainder of the year?
Well, unfortunately, we all know Turkey is a significant energy importer, right? I mean, each $10 increase in the oil price, the central bank tells us, adds about 1.1% to inflation. So, I mean, you can do the maths yourselves. This is going to be a significant inflation shock, absolutely. And then the other problem, obviously, is each $10 probably costs between $3 and $5 billion in terms of increased imports, right? So the current account deficit is wider. More pressure on the exchange rate, lots of debate in Turkey, obviously about competitiveness anyway, and whether there's going to be another exchange rate move, and that could add another leg to inflation, right? So, it looks like inflation was looking sticky anyway. I mean, that's the reality. I mean, recent inflation prints, even before the war, were a little bit disappointing. Maybe central bank had not done enough in terms of policy tightening, and then you have the inflation shock from the Gulf, obviously. So it looks like probably in the high 20s is more realistic. Elections probably, I mean, it's obviously talk of early elections, 27, 28. That's not an environment for very tight policy. So again, it suggests that the disinflation probably won't be very aggressive.
Well, the crisis in the Middle East is forcing central banks to reassess their monetary policy stances and paths. So the Turkish central bank has held rates steady for the last two meetings, and there's a growing consensus that rate cuts may be off the table until post-July. What are your expectations? What do you think the central bank's next move will be?
Well, I've been arguing for some time that policy should have been tighter anyway. It should have been higher for longer. Maybe I'm not very popular for saying that, but the fact that inflation is very sticky and high would suggest that policy should have been tighter, right? I think it's very hard for the central bank to cut rates now from here. We saw the last inflation print, for April was disappointing, sends a very poor signal. I think if they do cut early, they're not going to cut rates. I think it's very hard to see that unless miraculously the Gulf War ends, we're all wrong in terms of inflation. And I mean, Minister Shimshek and central bank would argue that there are some favourable base effects, right? Food price inflation, services, housing, all those kind of things will possibly help. But it just feels ultimately that growth is sticky. The Gulf War doesn't really help. I mean, maybe the question is not whether they'll cut rates, is can they avoid hiking rates from here? I think that's going to be difficult to avoid hiking. I mean, the Fed seems to have taken cuts off the table. We've seen some other central banks also seem to be more hawkish in terms of rhetoric. I know one small central bank recently, the Georgians, hiked policy rates. I mean, that, you know, one in Turkey's neighbourhood. That was probably the right decision.
And do you think that's what Turkish central bank will do in the next meeting? Hike rates?
Well, there's what they should do and what they will do. I would argue they should raise policy rates. You know, and given the inflation print that we've just seen from April, I think that I can't see how they can avoid that.
And do you think for the rest of the year, will we ever see a rate cut from the Turkish central bank in general?
Well, again, the world is uncertain, right? Who knows what's going to happen? I mean, you know, in a scenario where the Gulf War ends early and global growth, there is a demand destruction effect, as I mentioned, and maybe we see increased supply response from UAE, all those kind of things, and oil prices go lower, then maybe that's possible, right? You know, but I think it's unlikely.
Yeah, it's likely. So if we look at the bigger picture in general, how do you think Turkey has managed this period of geopolitical volatility in general, and especially in terms of economic resilience? How do you think Turkey is doing in terms of how is it differentiating from its peers?
Well, look, if you'd have told people, 3 or 4 years ago that there was going to be the US and Israel were going to attack Iran, oil prices were going to rise significantly, what would happen to the Turkish lira? I mean, I think most people would have said it would collapse. It hasn't. They've managed to hold the currency, avoided hiking policy rates, and the currency regime has remained in place. So that's kind of achievement. Sure, they lost reserves in defending the currency, but I guess you give them credit. They built the reserves in the period in 23 to record highs, so they had the ammunition to defend the currency. I guess a lot what happens now really is really what happens in terms of that Iran war scenario. If it continued extended period of insecurity and oil prices do stay high for longer, then the central bank may have to reconsider the FX regime or interest rate policy, right? But remember, and a lot of people, a lot of companies in Turkey complain about competitiveness, the strong lira, right? And I know, many companies are suffering in this environment, but a devaluation is not really a great solution, right? I mean, devaluation will the pass-through in Turkey is very high, right? So you will end up with higher inflation. So again, ultimately your competitiveness will be eroded over time. The solution is structural reforms. I would argue it's about better demand management, right? I mean, there is a growth versus inflation trade-off. Maybe some people thought that inflation could be beaten, without impacting on growth very much. I just don't see anywhere in the world where a country with very high inflation beats the inflation ultimately without sacrificing growth.
I also want to get your thoughts on the government's recent incentive plans. So the government has recently rolled out a comprehensive investment incentive package, mainly to attract foreign investment. What are your thoughts on this? Do you expect this to be a meaningful catalyst for more foreign direct investment?
Yeah, well, I guess the context has been the Iran war, where Gulf states, the UAE, Dubai, all these countries, their business model is suddenly in question, right? I mean, the whole Gulf state model was based on security. These places were hubs for tourism, logistics, transport, even manufacturing, right? Based on the assumption that they were secure. I guess that's no longer the case. We've seen the exodus of plenty of foreign expats from Dubai, etc. And I guess Turkey thinks, well, this is an opportunity, right? I mean, I think it is in many respects. I mean, I think the insecurity we're seeing globally, whether it's Russia's attack on Ukraine, the weakening of NATO, the US backstop for Europe weakening, and then the insecurity in the Middle East creates opportunities for a country like Turkey. It's very strong in defence tech. So I think defence tech cooperation between Turkey and Europe and also the Middle East is definitely there. We've heard about this trade corridor, from Saudi, an oil trade corridor out of Saudi through Jordan, up through Syria. I mean, I think medium to long term Turkey can be a beneficiary of that, definitely. And obviously this investment package is aimed to kind of promote that. I mean, people will challenge, the questions why foreign direct investment recently is so poor and a lot of the issues about rule of law. I mean, macro stability has been one of the problems, I think, in the last decade. I think there's more macro stability there, but then there's all the rule of law, institutional reform kind of stuff, checks and balances come into play. But look, in the end, Turkey, has a lot of positives in terms of its attributes, right? Entrepreneurial, pro-business culture, great demographics, good region, which provides lots of opportunities, good banking sector, good bankers, great engineers and managers are used to working in difficult environments. And its location is a strength, right? I mean, you've potentially got reconstruction stories in Ukraine and Syria and maybe the Gulf states, and Turkey is well positioned to take advantage of that. So there are still a lot of reasons why foreign direct investors will take a look at Turkey, right? And I think to bring them over the line, you do need macro stability, you do need low inflation, you need credible institutions, you've got a good central bank, and all the rule of law related things are important as well. Political stability is important too.
There's also an ongoing debate on whether or not the current economic program has run its course. Some critics argue that it requires a major overhaul or a complete pivot. From your vantage point, do you think the program has reached its limits?
Well, I guess the question is, what's the alternative, right? I mean, are you suggesting to me that Mehmet Şimşek should be removed, we should have a new central bank team, and there should be devaluation? I don't think that's really a solution, right? Again, I don't think a devaluation at this phase brings any wins. It just brings high inflation. I mean, you have high inflation because you had a period of, negative real interest rates, very loose monetary policy, very weak institutions at the central bank, and continued devaluation because of that, right? You don't want to see a return to that. But the reality is you're in an electoral cycle, probably. It makes a big revamp of the programme quite difficult, right? And maybe we're going to have to wait for the next fight against inflation to take it down a level till after those elections, because, again, it goes back to a growth versus inflation trade-off, and that there are consequences politically for that growth-inflation trade-off. I mean, Mehmet Şimşek has space. I mean, fiscal space. He's done a good job. I mean, he's criticised, in terms of going after tax evasion and compliance. I would argue he's done a good job. Look at the numbers. The fiscal, without the war in Iran, the fiscal deficit probably was 2.5% of GDP this year. Public sector debt less than 30%. There is fiscal space to spend before elections. If that is the case, though, I think monetary policy needs to stay tight, and I wouldn't recommend, moving to a different FX regime.
And lastly, looking at the global picture in general, how do you expect, if we move on to different central banks after talking about the Turkish central bank, do you expect the Fed and ECB, how do you expect the Fed and the ECB to shape their monetary policy paths for the remainder of the year? Yeah, well, we have new leadership at the Fed, yep. Right? We'll have to see what happens there. I think the message from the Fed and the ECB. And actually, colleagues were at the IMF meetings recently in Washington, and the message from policymakers was one of caution, that they're nervous about the war in Iran. They don't quite understand why global markets have stayed so resilient, why the S&P is as high as it is. And they are worried about the supply chain shock and the inflation shock. And you just sense that there's a cautiousness from central bankers that, the idea that the Fed, pressurised by Trump, is going to cut policy rates, that doesn't seem likely. And they're in wait and see mode. Let's see what the inflation numbers are. Will they have to hike policy rates? I mean, again, I think it's less likely they cut
given the inflation risks. But again, a lot of uncertainties. Obviously, it depends on the war in Iran. I mean, it's just so uncertain, right?
Everything goes back to the war in Iran. Mr. Ash, thank you so much for joining the program.
My pleasure. Very nice
Joining
to meet
us.
you. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.